This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. And today in studio, we have Dr. Laura DeWald. And Dr. DeWald is a forest genetics specialist in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. And it's a pleasure to have you in studio today.
Thank you.
And so today we're going to be talking about white oak genetics. And before we talk about tree genetics, tell us a little bit about how you got interested in genetics.
It's kind of a fluky thing. So as an undergraduate in forestry school, we had to pick a concentration at that time, and I really love soil science, and I love genetics, and I couldn't decide which way to go. I was kind of just intrigued about all the different species and how they came about, and then I took a soil taxonomy course, and I didn't like it, so I ended up in forest genetics. And then just really enjoyed the whole using the plant genetics to be able to get a better seedling. And then I'm all about sustainability and the regeneration part of forestry. That's always been my favorite part. And so genetics fits in there in terms of getting good seedlings. Mm-hmm. So then I just continued to pursue that at the master's level and then at the PhD.
So tell us what you do here at UK.
Here, I was hired to basically get a tree improvement program going. And actually I won't say never, we've done very little tree improvement in the hardwoods because tree improvement at the beginning tends to be very expensive. And the trees grow relatively slowly, and so it's a long-term venture, and sometimes it can be hard to convince the powers to be that, you need this plantation out there for 30 years, 50 years, compared to things, for example, compared to tree improvement in the southern pines where, we can harvest at 9 years. So it's more difficult to do it. And so a venture like ours has actually never been attempted on the scale that we're going to try to do it. But we reached a point in white oak that we need to do tree improvement because we need higher quality seedlings for a variety of reasons. So if some of your listeners have heard about some of the other podcasts about the problems with white oak regeneration, it's just not getting to the overstory. So we have lots of seedlings out there, and certainly that's part of a forest management problem. But also, from my perspective, it's a little bit of a genetic problem because we have been kind of selectively taking out some of the best white oaks, which means the not so great white oaks are left, and those are the ones providing seed. So if we have sort of a little bit lower quality or less desirable white oak tree being left in the forest, and that's what's providing the acorns, then over time, the quality of your acorns and the seedlings that come from those is going to go down. Certainly, there's been some forest management kinds of things happening, but definitely there's a genetic thing happening. And so what we want to do is reverse that and figure out how to do that. So part of my task here then is to basically from scratch to get a tree improvement program going. And that starts with sampling the material, so finding good trees out in the forest, and then bringing those acorns from those really good trees in, and then growing those. Because sometimes a good tree in the forest could just be because it found that sweet spot in the soil. It's got really good water, it's got the perfect nutrients, and so looks really good because, it has all those, it's kind of that nurture versus nature kind of thing happening for trees. And so sometimes you'll collect acorns from that tree and they just don't perform very well when you test them to see how well they grow or whatever other traits you're interested in. Other times it could be actually not as nice of a tree just because it's on a kind of a poor site, but it has really good genetics. So it's doing the best it can because it's got good genetics, but it's a really dry site or it doesn't have the nutrients, and so you bring acorns from that in and they produce these really great seedlings. So you don't really know, looking at trees in the forest, which are genetically good or poor. So we bring those in, we bring acorns from a variety of trees in, we grow them in a nursery into seedlings, and then we plant those seedlings out. And that's called a progeny test, because what we're doing is we are testing the progeny to see how they compare to the parents. And then based on that information, now that process of growing those trees could be 50 years, but we don't have to wait 50 years. Some things we can determine pretty quickly. But they're going to be growing for a pretty long time. And then what then we'll be doing is we're looking at them and we're collecting data and we go, oh, well, trees A, B, and X are really good. And so then the trees that do really well in a progeny test are the trees then that we use to create a seed orchard, which is just like an apple orchard, except for we're growing white oak acorns. So now we have the very best trees all in one location. They're all pollinating each other, so you have the best mixing with the best. And so then the acorns from those trees should result in superior seedlings. Again, depends on the trait you're talking about here. And then those are the ones then that we would collect and grow as seedlings and then plant, actually artificially plant, which means humans plant them instead of nature planting them, out in the forest. And so then over time, if we can continue to do that over several generations, we are going to get a higher quality seedling, which should grow faster, should be a better competitor, should reach those overstories. It should, because it's a healthier seedling and thus healthier tree, it should actually provide better function in the forest, which means it's going to help overall forest health. So this is not just for products, but we're also interested in products because there's money generated from that. You would get better logs, for example, to harvest for different kinds of things. Thinking about wildlife, for example, white oak is a preferred acorn for many, many species. So one of the choices, for example, that we could make is, trees A, B, and C in our progeny tests started producing acorns at a younger age, and they produce big acorns. So that might be a trait that the Wild Turkey Federation, for example, might be interested in. So the really cool thing about this project is that we will be able to match trees and traits with a variety of different stakeholder groups. So my job here is to get this whole thing started, which is
it's a lot, sounds like.
Yeah, it's a little overwhelming sometimes. But it's fun because I love growing trees.
So tell us how and where you're collecting the acorns from.
Well, normally in a tree improvement program, you're just collecting acorns from a small area. But we decided to kind of go big or go home. Well, and also because we know almost nothing about white oak genetics. And we have climate change happening. What works in Kentucky, for example, here, may not be the best trees in the future. Maybe we want Tennessee or North Carolina acorns growing in Kentucky in the future, but the bottom line is we don't know. And that's where we make mistakes from a forest management perspective, is lack of knowledge. So we want to make sure that we're forging ahead with good knowledge. So we actually decided to collect acorns from the entire range, which is where in the United States that you can find white oak, which is from west of the Mississippi, sort of just the eastern edges of the Dakotas, all the way to the East Coast, and it goes from southern Maine all the way down to northern Florida. So somehow we have to figure out how to get acorns from all of those places and also not have it so diluted. You don't want just one collection from each state. So then the questions are, well, how many per state and how many per region? So we're still kind of working through some of those questions, but we definitely want basically a good sample from every state that white oak occurs in. And we started that already. There's no way I could go running around and collecting all those because white oak is a little unique in that most tree species we can collect seed and put it in a cold room and store it. And what that allows you to do is collect over months or over years, for example, until you have all your seed collections done. The problem with white oak is that it wants to germinate immediately after the acorn falls off the tree. So what that means is the acorn lands on the ground and the root starts to grow into the soil for about 3 to 4 inches deep. And then that acorn with that root down in the ground, that's the beginning of a baby taproot's what we call it. It's going to sit there over the winter, just like that. And then in the spring, it's all set up to snag all of that extra water that's typically there in the spring from snow melt and those spring rains. And then it grows very quickly. So the challenge is, even if we pick up the acorns off the ground and put them in a cold room, they're still going to grow that root, even though they don't know it's not in the soil. And so that root is still going to grow, which makes it almost impossible to plant without breaking that root. And the other tricky thing, most tree species, they don't produce a lot of seed every single year. Because a tree has to, they don't decide mentally, but there is a difference in terms of if they take the energy they're making for growth versus energy they're making for seed production. And for a tree, you always want to grow. Taller always wins when you're a tree. Because you're just able, if you're taller, you've got a bigger leaf area, which means you also have greater roots, and you just get bigger gets more resources. That's just how it works in the forest. A tree has to give up some of that growth because that's energy it would need to make seeds. So most trees have what we call a periodic production of seed, which means, folks probably have noticed this, it seems like sometimes there's so many acorns on the ground, it's like walking on marbles outside, and then other years there's almost nothing. Okay, and so that's an example of that. So this year, which was our first year of acorn collection, of course over most of the United States, eastern United States, it was a very poor mast year.
Oh, no.
I know. I almost thought, well, maybe we should just wait. And I thought, no, let's just go ahead and see what we can find. Because if we can find trees producing in an overall poor mast year, those actually might be the trees that we want. Because it doesn't do us any good to make seedlings if we don't get acorns. So we just forged ahead. And so what I decided to do is I contacted extension folks, and they then helped me get in touch with master gardener groups and master naturalist groups, some nonprofit groups, such as an urban forestry councils, and a variety of different kinds of citizens. It just sort of spun out from there. And then I also contacted state forestry organizations. So in Kentucky, that's the Kentucky Division of Forestry. Also the Forest Service, so both the National Forest System and also the research branch of the Forest Service. And so wherever I could think of, I just reached out and said, would you be willing to collect? What we did is I put together a collection kit, and all I needed was a 1-gallon Ziploc bag per tree. And I usually asked if someone could collect, depending on how many people, but, from 1 to 5 trees. We want them spread out because we don't want them pollinating each other, because we want to sample a lot of genetic variation. So we had these collection kits. So if someone was willing to collect, or at least look, again, some people weren't successful because they thought their tree that always produced acorns just didn't produce this year. And that's okay, because maybe it'll produce next year, and they kept that collection kit for me. We sent the collection kits out, so they had some instructions with them, and they had the Ziploc bag, and they included a postage-paid box to get the acorns back to the University of Kentucky. And then I went through and I did all the stuff that I needed to do until we were ready to get them planted into the nursery. So we had we sent out 345 kits. Mm-hmm. The person would email me back, and there's no acorns. I'm like, it's okay. I said, if you want to still participate, hang on to it. I'll contact you next August. We'll try next year. Because again, that tree could produce a lot of acorns in the next year.
So August is the typical time they drop?
Well, that's when you can start to see the baby acorns.
Okay.
So, because there's a little bit of competition with deer and other animals and birds and squirrels that want the acorns also,
right.
And so you do have to compete a little bit. So sometimes if you see the baby acorns up in the tree growing, then okay, that tree is going to have acorns, and then you can sort of stake it out when you try to compete with the wildlife for the acorns. So the acorns are mature and start to drop, and this is another way that oak is a little different from other species. Is like an apple, you can pick green and it will ripen up, turn into a nice red apple. Well, white oak's a little pickier. Those acorns want to stay on that tree until they are ready to germinate. Ready for that root to start growing. And if you pick them, they won't grow. They won't ripen up. And again, so normally in a tree improvement program, you go out and you collect green, because you can pull them right off the tree. but not with white oak, and that's okay because sometimes that's what I love about different species. They just do nature created all kinds of cool little different ways that our different tree species act. So the acorns typically up north would be dropping off the tree in late September. Down south, probably not till mid-November. So there's a pretty big range. And so there was a big range for people that did find acorns. They put them in the bags and they sent them to me, and that whole part worked really well. That's an area where I can always use more people. So if anyone wants to look for acorns, please definitely let us know. And I'll be organizing that kind of in August. And then we'll get it started next year. Because it will take us actually to sample the entire eastern United States. It will take us probably 4 to 5 years to get it all done. Now that said, Arkansas, I don't know why, but Arkansas this year had really good acorn production. So we may be done with the state of Arkansas. But overall, we did manage to get over 17,000 acorns planted, and those came from 91 trees scattered across 6 states. So even though it was a poor mast year, I'm glad I didn't wait because we were able to get a good start.
So how do you know if an acorn is good enough for your program to plant it?
Well, you don't, which is really tricky. But there are 2 things that you can do, and I didn't ask my acorn collectors to do that this past fall, but I might ask them to try to do it next fall. Because the first thing that you do is, or that I would do when I would get a bag in, is we do what's called a float test, which is basically you dump the entire bag of acorns into a bucket of water. And if they float, those are no good. Usually what that means is the weevils have gotten in there, because everybody likes acorns besides, just humans.
Even bugs, huh?
Exactly. Well, because that acorn in there is a really good nutrient source. And it's really important for a lot of species. And so there's a lot of competition out there for acorns. So if they float, a lot of times either the acorn didn't form properly or an insect got in there and chomped away, and so you've got that air pocket. So you basically scoop away all the ones that float, and then even some of the ones that sink, as I would pull them out, I would look at them, I would inspect them for a little hole, because the little acorn weevils get in there when the acorn is immature, and that's actually how they grow, is they basically eat that acorn. So sometimes the acorns will still sink, but they've got a weevil hole in them. So, and the really sad part is the poor acorns. Sometimes you would actually they would float, but they actually have that root coming out of them. And what happened if you actually open the acorn up is the weevil had gotten in there and eaten the top part off, but the cells that make the root don't know that the top is gone.
Oh.
So it would still grow root, but obviously it would never grow into anything. And then there's just a lot of other things that happen where the seed, again, that you don't know, it just turned out it just won't grow a seedling. So a lot of things have to happen correctly, just like in any kind of reproduction scenario for successful reproduction. So, but that's why we plant them. And then next spring, we'll kind of know which acorn collections actually had really good seedling production.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So you grow them all in a greenhouse?
Because we want these trees to be able to go into the forest. So we are not babying them.
Okay.
Because if they can't get through a nursery scenario, then that's kind of nature's first selection situation right there. Now, we did hand plant because we had to keep track of, genetically of each parent tree. So we didn't use the machine planter, which would be a normal operating procedure at the nursery. But other than that, we had the machine planter go through and actually create the little rows that we planted, and then we hand planted groups of parents, because again, we have to keep track of each group that a tree came from, because we want to remember we're trying to evaluate those parents back in the woods. We hand planted them, but then other than that, they're following normal operating procedures in the nursery. So because again, they have to be able to survive that environment, because ultimately when we have these improved seeds, they will be grown in a nursery, and those are the seedlings, those are the improved seedlings then that will be available, and that we hope everybody will start using for reforestation. And it doesn't even have to be after a harvest. You can take those, because remember I said earlier, some of the trees left in the forest are not as good as they used to be. And so if you plant an improved seedling next to a newly germinated seedling from not such a great tree, that improved seedling should be able to outcompete it. So even though there's natural regeneration happening in the forest, in the future, with this big supply that will be coming of improved seedlings, we should be able to plant those in the forest in a natural setting, and then the resulting trees from those again will be increasing the quality of the white oak resource in the forest.
Since this is the first year, you don't know, but do you have a theory on how many of those acorns will actually grow?
Of course, I'm hoping for all of them. Every time I'm out at the nursery, I give them a little pep talk. Come on, grow. The average actually, sadly, is around 40%. And that's mainly because, again, looking at the acorn, even if it sinks in our float tank, you just don't always know. There could be insects and things in there. So typically, a low would be around 40%. I'm hoping for a little bit higher than that, but we'll see. Because again, a high percent germination is a genetic thing that already gives us some information about parent trees that we might want to go back to collect more from in the future.
And what type of data are you collecting, or are they collecting information on the trees that, they give you a Ziploc bag of acorns? Do they collect anything about the site or the tree itself?
Well, we were trying to have our acorn collectors use Tree Snap, which is an app on your phone that was developed, and a lot of them did that. Not everyone did it, but most people did it, and so that they take a picture of the tree, and they estimate height and diameter, etc. And again, sort of what that parent tree looks like may not be all that meaningful genetically, so I didn't want people to have to spend a lot of extra time doing that part. However, part of the goal for me over time is the trees that we decided to really move forward in the program, to try to collect some genetic appearance information of kind of what they look like. So kind of diameter, how far up is that first branch. So they have a lot of epicormic branching, which is the little branches that stick out all along the trunk of the tree, because those make little knots. And so anyone that's ever worked with wood or try to put a hammer through those little knots, and it can be really hard. So there's a lot of things like that we might try to get a handle of by visiting the parent tree.
All right, so how many different nurseries or locations did you plant these in?
Well, right now we're just using the Kentucky Division of Forestry's Morgan County Nursery, which is over by West Liberty, because they have the space, and they're actually actively involved. They've actually contributed. They're one of our funding partners. They've got it down pretty well. There is a nursery in western Kentucky. They could also grow them, but it's just a little further for me to get to. They've been doing some other things. For example, they've been growing, the Western Nursery grew bur oak for us, and we're going to be using that actually to clone some of the parents onto, which seems kind of weird. Why wouldn't we clone white oak to white oak? But actually, bur oak roots are not as picky as white oak about what it grows in. White oak kind of wants it to be perfect, not too wet, not too dry, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas bur oak, it's like, yeah, a little wet here, it's okay, I'm still good. So what we're going to try to do, because we are interested in the parent trees as well, so we are in the process, this is what's happening in the next month or so, is we're going to establish what's called a clone bank. And what we're doing with that is we're going actually to those parent trees that our acorn collectors collected acorns from, and we collect twig material from up as high in the tree as we can, And we graft those then onto our bur oak seedlings. And so this is the same process as essentially almost every tree in an apple orchard, for example, is actually grafted. And most of your grapevines, for example, that they make. A lot of things are grafted these days. And so what that allows is it gives us a chance to get multiple identical genetic copies of that parent tree. And that way, if that parent tree, for some reason, because remember I said earlier, the progeny test takes a long time before all the results will come in. We may lose track of that original parent tree. It may be harvested. It may just die of old age. It may be struck by lightning. You never know.
A lot of different things.
Yeah, people might forget where it is. And so the idea then is to basically create this collection of parent material, and we'll have these genetic copies. And so when it comes time to create that seed orchard that I mentioned, we don't have to try to find, because that could be 20 years from now, we don't have to try to go find that original tree. We can go to our clone bank and get the material, because we can regraft from that clone bank to create our seed orchard. So, because that's always the tricky part. You say, oh, well, these were the best parent trees. But you've got to be able to find those parent trees, and being able to do that, especially across the entire eastern United States, is quite the task. But it is actually one of the things that is making our project one of the very unique tree improvement projects, because we'll have a clone bank over time of essentially the entire white oak resource from north to south and east to west. And so it's pretty cool. So, for example, if one of the parents' offspring turns out to be disease resistant to something, we know where that parent is because we have it in the clone bank. If a few of those tree seedlings that are growing up just are really straight and they grow really fast, we're like, oh, those are the ones we want. We can go to the clone bank and get those. So this is a pretty exciting endeavor, and grafting will start in about a month and a half or so.
So obviously the acorns are pretty important, obviously. So what exactly is an acorn? What exactly does it do? What's its role or function?
Okay. The next time you eat a peanut or even a pea, if you gently pull it apart, they have those two halves, and look at the bottom, there's a little bump there. And that little bump is the baby peanut or the baby pea. An acorn is the exact same thing. And so all that stuff that you eat, the peanut or the peas or a corn kernel, to provide us food and energy, that's exactly what that does for that baby plant, is it provides the energy for that baby plant to grow. That's why I love peanuts, because if you look at it, you can literally just with your eyes, you can see the little tiny root and the little tiny baby leaves. You gotta look closely, you may need a magnifying glass, but they're there. And so the acorn is the same way. And so because the acorn likes to put that root system down, so some of that acorn part is providing the energy that root needs to grow. And then that acorn then will also provide the energy that the new stems need and the new leaves need. And then once that germinating acorn starts to produce leaves that are green, obviously, then the seedling can handle it from there, and it doesn't really need the acorn part anymore. So acorns are edible to humans as well. Not all species are palatable or taste good. So white oak is one of the more palatable ones. You can actually grind it up and make flour and make bread. I have to admit, I tried it. It didn't taste very good. But I might have just been a reflection of my skills as a cook. But just like it's food for us, it's food for wildlife, it's food for all the insect, that's why I say, and birds. And so that the actual acorn part, most of that is to provide energy for the baby seedling. So it's basically stocked with nutrients and carbohydrates and everything other than water that the acorn needs, that little seedling will need to start growing. Some seeds are teensy tiny. Any seed, if you open it up, you can find that same little packet of material in there. Again, nature just designed trees differently, and nature designed acorns to have a lot of stuff in there. And again, especially good for wildlife and of course good for the germinating white oak seedlings as well.
What's the little cap on the acorn?
That would be one of nature's just really cool mysteries. And you don't have to be out there very long in nature. I would tell all my students, It's a mystery. No one knows. And you can actually identify different white oaks based on, or different oak species based on the characteristics of their caps. Why they're different, again, nobody knows. There's a lot of really cool mysteries, yeah. And some of the caps are really, really cool looking. Some are like little berets, some are like middle, deeper caps. And they're all different. And the size and shape of acorns also vary among different oak species. And why are some teeny tiny and why are some big? So that's one of just the wonderful mysteries of nature and trees.
It's probably no different than us. Some people have brown hair, some have or blue eyes and brown eyes and, that kind of thing. So it's nature's mystery. It's called the White Oak Genetics Program. I guess we should have asked this earlier. Why white oak?
Well, white oak has particular importance right now, which is a shift because normally northern red oak is the species that actually had garnered all the attention in the past. In a lot of cases, we as foresters expected northern red oak to kind of take the place of the American chestnut because it was kind of the logical species to do that. So as we lost the American chestnut, northern red oak was the biggest and the fastest growing, and we thought that was going to take the place in it. And so a lot of efforts kind of went into growing northern red oak and figuring stuff out. And as it turned out, it didn't quite do what we thought, which, again, we learn all the time. Every day we're learning. And so white oak had kind of just been ignored. And when people started really looking and forest research in the forest, and again, they started noticing that we are losing the species from the forest. Yes, species over time have always gone extinct. That's, again, part of nature. But when you see an accelerated rate of loss of a species or populations going down, and or when we can attribute that to things that humans might have done, then that's not a natural extinction event. Now, white oak is not in danger of extinction yet, but it could be. If we did nothing, it may not be lost everywhere in the eastern United States, but in many places you would lose that species entirely from the forest. And the danger of that is that white oak actually provides a lot of important functions to the forest. So it would change the forest with white oak not being there. And some of the things we know, but some of the things we don't know at all, because those are some of the harder mysteries for us to solve in the forest. And so we started noticing that while there was a lot of regeneration of white oak, it was missing from sort of that what we call mid canopy. So when you look up, not quite all the way to the top of the forest, but kind of halfway up in tree height. And then the only tree size, the big trees, were quite old. And so people started looking at ages and started noticing, oh, well, wait a minute, there's starting to be an age gap here. We have really old, and we have a lot of really young, and nothing in between. And sometimes it's hard to tell, well, is that natural or not? So, is that something that we need to worry about? So what you do is you go and you look at records over time, and we look at reference conditions, and we look at healthy forests, and what you would notice in those is no, in the past there had been a balanced age structure. We have all the different ages and sizes that you want, and you had much greater numbers. And then there's a change, and that change happened pretty fast in terms of over a small number of years. So then you're like, okay, well, something's going wrong. And then more and more people started looking, and again, we still don't have it all solved. We're still trying to figure it all out. From a genetics perspective, I'm like, well, okay, I just need to get really good seedlings in there to try to reverse part of this. And some of the other specialists can work on some of the other issues. And so, I don't know that other species are having that. Well, some species we know are having the same problems, especially where there's a disease or an insect that's attacking the particular species. We don't have that yet with white oak anyway, so we're at least a little bit insect and disease free in terms of non-native things that could wipe out populations. But we're still losing the trees. And right now, white oak is desirable from a product standpoint. So they are being harvested, and that's a good thing. We all use products made from the forest. And so if we're harvesting products but they're not being replaced, then that's unsustainable, and that's not good forest management, and that's not something we want to be doing. So we've got to figure this out, and so that's where there's this big interest right now with white oak. And so it opened a nice little window of opportunity to say, hey, I know genetics is expensive, but let's do it anyway. There's a lot more people willing to spend money and time to help us, because there's a lot of interest right now in white oak. Mm-hmm. So that actually helps a tree improvement program get off and running.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So if we have people that are interested in collecting acorns in the fall, will you be accepting that, or how can they get in contact with you?
Absolutely. So we've got a website up, and you can find me on the Forestry departmental page. And so any of those, or contacting any of the extension folks, they also know how to get in touch with me as well. All they need to do is send me an email, and I'll take it from there. So we have pretty kind of spotty in the sense of some regions of Kentucky we got good collections from, and some not so much. But if someone wants to collect it, because we don't know what tree might be like the tree, so you might be able to find the tree that is like those superior trees. And so I'm willing to take anyone who wants to go look. I am more than happy to send a collection kit out. Definitely, we're going to start to focus on areas where we have gaps, because again, as I said earlier, we want to collect from the entire eastern United States. And so I think we might have Arkansas done, because they had such a good, they were only one of the few places that had really good acorns. And like Tennessee, I've got all the way on the west by Memphis, and I have all the way in the east in the Cherokee National Forest, but I have nothing in between. So, and Kentucky's kind of like that too. It's just spotty. So again, that's part of what we're working on, is to fill in those gaps. And so sometimes people have a favorite place they hunt or they hike, and they're like, well, sure, I'll go look for acorns for you. I mean, you want to make sure that folks ask permission, obviously, from the landowner to collect acorns. But absolutely, all they have to do is contact me, and I'll get you a collection kit sent out. And again, I'll probably wait till the end of the summer coming up, just so you don't lose it.
Right.
And I don't forget to send it. Then it's just a matter of waiting and out competing the squirrels and the deer. And
so will you start this process that you've told us about all over again next year with the new acorns?
It's exactly right. And the year after, and the year after, and maybe the year after. It kind of depends again on how successful we are. But yes, all the steps get repeated each year until we think we've sampled everything we can sample.
How old are the trees when you pull them out to plant them somewhere else?
They're just 1 year old.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there's little babies. They're about 6 to 12 inches tall. We could let them grow bigger in a nursery, because what white oak likes to do is put roots down really deep. If you wait longer than a year, it's really hard to get them harvested out of the nursery. So typically what happens is we planted the acorns in the fall, and those little root systems have already started growing into the soil. They will grow. We'll leave them growing in the nursery all the way until they'll go dormant. We don't want to mess with them in the nursery until they're fully dormant. So they'll drop their leaves just like trees in the forest, and they'll be fully dormant. In December, for example, we'll use a machine lifter, which actually goes down underneath the nursery bed and gently pops them all up, so we don't go in there with shovels anymore. I mean, we could, but that would take a long time.
It would take a while.
So the machine lifter goes, and it just lifts them all up, and it shakes the seedlings a little bit so the soil drops off. And then we'll collect them, and we wash the roots off. So we don't wash with soap and water. We just spray the soil off. And we bundle them in really thick paper bags, 20 times like what you would see in a grocery store. So they're pretty thick paper bags. And then we put them in a cold room, so a room that sits around 40 degrees or so. So we don't want to freeze them, but they stay cold. And what that does is when a tree is in dormancy, it's pretty much like a bear in hibernation. They're still living, but the metabolism is just very slow. And what the tree is doing is the tree is not actually counting, but it's accumulating chilling hours, so which are hours below a certain temperature. Because that's how that little acorn can tell. So out in the woods, that's how that little acorn can tell when it's time to start to grow. Temperature does have some influence, but if seedlings thought they could start growing then, when it gets really cold, they would all be killed. And so what most tree seedlings do is they accumulate those number of hours below a certain temperature. Once that has been accumulated, they know, okay, enough days have gone by, and that's when then temperature will start to come into play, and when the days get a little bit longer, they can actually sense both of those cues. So in the cold room, what's kind of nice is they're not faked out by any of the warm temperatures. That's at constant cold temperatures. And then when they would be ready to start growing in the spring, we're going to not wait that long. We're actually going to pull them out while they're still dormant and plant them. That's when folks can plant them out in the forest or in their wooded backyards or in their woodlands, for example. So they would get sent actually dormant seedlings. And then those are ready to be transplanted because, again, they're kind of just not doing anything, so the disturbance doesn't bother them that much. They get planted while they're still dormant, which would be probably around in March, and then they're off and running.
So are you tracking those that are planted after the year? Or I thought you had mentioned something about seeing which grows taller.
Yes.
So how did you track it?
So for the tree improvement program, we are going to plant those, again, in what's called a progeny test. And it's a little tricky because normally we would plant everything all at one time, but because we're collecting over time, we're still going to use the same progeny test site. We're just going to add to it. So if you think of like a football field, we'll plant probably the first, 20 yards down by the end zone this year. And then the following year, repeat the process, and then we would, plant another 10 years. And again, they're kind of randomly mixed there. And we don't want to do just one progeny test because sometimes the offspring of a parent are really picky and they only do well in a very limited situation. And a lot of times those are trees that are very what we call locally adapted. So like I can grow really well right here. But then we also have trees that are genetically superior, and those trees basically grow well no matter where you put them. And those are the ones that are really, really, really beneficial to us. You also have the flip side. You have some trees that don't grow offspring that they don't grow very well no matter where you put them. So we're trying to find right now, and this is a big challenging part of the White Oak Genetics program, is finding those sites, finding a progeny test site, not just in Kentucky, but for example, it'd be really good to have one in Missouri and one in the Southeast somewhere and somewhere in the Northeast and the Midwest. But, we're asking for 25 to 30 acres, and it has to be cultivated and fenced because we have to protect from deer at least until they get tall enough. And because remember, these trees, what we want to do is we want to see how they compare to each other. And so you want to try to minimize anything extra that could happen to them. So we don't want grazing, and we don't want, so we fence it. Sometimes in the first year they may get irrigated, but that's not necessary. But definitely we cultivate so that it's, bare ground, at least in strips where we're going to plant the trees. Because again, we don't necessarily want grass competition in that first year. We want to get them established so they can grow. That's where the seedlings in the nursery will be going. They'll be going to at least one progeny test, hopefully 3. And into the future, our partners around in the different states, we're hoping to get progeny tests set up with those partners as well. So we're in the process of establishing who might be interested in doing that and where those sites might be. But then ultimately, down the road, once, seedling, parent tree, Susie did really, really well, no matter what progeny test it was in. So we're going to go to that clone bank, and we're going to find Susie.
Yeah.
We're going to get acorns from. And so then Once we start operationally growing, because we've got our information now, and so now we've got superior seedlings. We know they're superior. They're going to be superior seedlings because they came from that seed orchard. So they would follow the same steps as we're doing right now. They'd be grown for a year in that nursery, and then they would be sent out to whoever wants to plant white oak will have access to superior white oak seedlings into the future. And that's the ultimate goal. Because if we did all this tree improvement and no one outplanted the seedlings, then we didn't really make any progress.
Right.
So, and this is a little different because most tree improvement programs are set up for industry. And so industry has their plantations and they're going to be growing those seedlings. Well, we want these seedlings to go into the natural forest as well. So, we will be encouraging the Kentucky Division of Forestry and the Forest Service and the tree farmers and anyone who has woodlands that wants to regenerate white oak to get it from the nursery that's been producing these superior seedlings and plant them out so that over time we can make that shift with higher quality seedlings in the forest. Some people are concerned about, well, aren't you reducing genetic diversity and isn't that a bad thing? And all of our studies have actually shown, no matter what species, when we do tree improvement, and this is not the same as like corn, okay, because corn you look out, it's all the same genetics, right? But they harvest it in a year and then they have different genetics the next year. Well, our trees are going to be out there for 300 or so years. So we don't want identical copies out there because in the seed orchard, they are cross-pollinating each other. And so you actually generate a lot of genetic variation. So you actually have the same amount of genetic variation. It's just your average is different. So let's say if I just pulled acorns from the forest right now and I grew them, maybe the average is 6 feet tall in 5 years. Well, some of those are going to be shorter than 6 feet, and some of those are going to be taller than 6 feet. Now, my genetically improved seedlings, if I did the exact same thing, hopefully the average would be maybe 20 feet in that same amount of time if we're got super trees growing. But there would still be shorter trees and taller trees. So we talk about this range of variation. So your range of variation is still going to stay the same. We just change the mean value. We're just increasing or decreasing depending on the trait that you're interested in.
Okay. Well, you've presented us with a lot of great information. We greatly appreciate that. Do you have a takeaway item or two that you'd want to leave our listeners with?
First of all, we do want to let folks know that we can plant white oak seedlings in the forest in a natural setting. That is okay. It doesn't have to come from Mother Nature, the tree dropping the acorn, etc. Okay, so when a tree does it by itself in the forest, that's natural regeneration. But we can do the same thing and plant a seedling. That seedling is going to be more competitive than an acorn because it just got through a lot of steps that skipped a lot of steps that the acorn had to deal with. So definitely we want to change folks' thinking a little bit about how we can get white oak regenerated in the forest, and we can plant seedlings. Also, this is a big collaborative effort, and we want to be inclusive, not exclusive. So anyone who wants to play a role, whether it be helping us collect acorns or sending us an email saying, oh, so-and-so has this, 20-acre back acres that they might be interested in planting, because we will have extra seedlings that I'm not throwing away, that folks could potentially use. So it's okay. Let's plant them there and see how some of those seedlings do. So we would have seedlings available, definitely collecting acorns, because that's our first and probably the most crucial step is getting a really good sample. So even if you have relatives, for example, in New York, call them up and go, hey, you want to collect? And we can help you with tree ID and all that kind of good stuff. So tree genetics and breeding is just like we do for a lot of our crops and our agricultural crops, and it works. And we can take what Mother Nature has started and basically just help out. So we're not trying to change anything per se. We're just trying to help out. And trees have a harder problem because what may have worked 200 years ago may not be working today. And nature can take a little bit of time to solve those problems, but sometimes trees don't have that time. So part of our goal, and we want people to recognize and support things like tree breeding and tree improvement, because we can help Mother Nature out with things like moving seed sources to handle climate change or some of the other kinds of things. So I guess take home is just that awareness and knowledge out there. If you're interested in doing something, you're more than welcome to. It doesn't have to be collecting acorns. There's all kinds of ways to get involved in the project. And just next time you see that white oak, I have definitely grown a great appreciation of the challenges that little acorn has. So next, don't take those little white oaks out there for granted, because they're doing the best they can, but they definitely could use some help from us, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And if you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Now stay tuned for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
All right, that sounds more like a car alarm.
It does. It has a cadence as such, and we're going to kind of continue on our nuthatch trend from last week, and this is our winter resident nuthatch, the red-breasted nuthatch.
Okay.
Slightly smaller than the white-breasted from last week, and as the name suggests, just like last week, this one has a red chest, but it has a slightly more distinct facial area. It's got basically an eye line and a white eyebrow to go along with the blackish cap on the top of the head. So it's black hat, white eyebrow, and a dark eye line. So to go along with that red chest. So they're pretty easily identified between the two nuthatches. They have similar behavior in how they'll land and face down the tree like we talked about last time.
Right.
The white-breasted nuthatch will focus more on deciduous forests and trees. The red-breasted nuthatch is actually more your carnivorous or conifers. So you're also looking at spruce, your pines, hemlocks. That's more of what the trees that they focus on.
And they do the same thing. So are they looking for bugs as well?
They're also looking for bugs. That's part of the mainstay of their diet. And eat a few more seeds. They eat the smaller seeds as well. They're a smaller bird. They're only about 4.5 inches in size, which is about half to a full inch smaller than the white-breasted nuthatch. And they're also only about a third of an ounce instead of a half to a full ounce.
So they're smaller.
So they are smaller, yep. And their wingspan's about 2 inches smaller as well, right around 8 inches thereabouts. So slightly smaller nuthatch in general. And these guys, what makes them different from a lot of other birds is they're also cavity nesters like the white-breasted nuthatch. This species prefers to make its own cavity. So they'll actually create their own cavity similar to a woodpecker. For a little bird, that's a lot of work. So there's a little tree damage, I guess, that comes with that if you have concerns. But when you're talking about a cavity that might be the size of a baseball,
It's not too bad.
it probably is not going to do too much damage to the tree long term.
Do they come back to that same place year after
They
year?
make new cavities.
Do they?
Yes. Yeah. That helps a lot of times. Like birds make new nests most of the time. Helps with parasite loads, keeping those down, and therefore more success for survival of the nestlings.
Too bad we can't train these birds to detect EAB and find them out.
Well, that'd be nice.
It'd be wonderful.
And, some of them are probably, the woodpeckers are probably taking advantage of that. But
Right.
by the point that they're in there, it's already done. Damage
Right.
is done.
Yeah.
So
Same number of eggs.
Well, so these guys will have a few less eggs. So
Oh,
they're
okay.
anywhere between 2 to 8 eggs, whereas the white-breasted was 5 to 9. They only have one brood, and because they're a little bit smaller, your incubation time is only about 13 days, which is a few days shorter. And also, by the time nestling stages, about 5 to 8 days less, so 18 to 21 days.
And you say they don't stick around here.
They actually breed in the north, but they'll come down here during non-breeding season. So the fall migration, they come down and they'll be here all winter long.
Okay.
So it's one that you could also see at your feeder.
Yeah.
Oh, but yeah, and they land on the tree and look down. You know it's a nuthatch.
You know it's a nuthatch that way. All right. Well, thanks for coming in and talking about them.
No problem.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.